All right, good afternoon, everyone. We are going to have a fun session for the last hour before we head into the dinner on a topic that I think continues to gain momentum and steam in business operations globally. And with me, we have a phenomenal panel, really distinguished individuals, Jaime Ellertson, Everbridge, Jerry Dixon, CrowdStrike, Tom Gann, McAfee, Kris Lovejoy, Ernst & Young, Tom Goodman, Raytheon, and Kostin Rao Kaspersky. So what I think, if you understood and you were at the forum this morning, there was a closed-door Chatham House rules conversation between law enforcement and industry that went very well and brought up a lot of interesting conversations. We're going to try and replicate some of those conversations as best we can here today. I think the lunch session on AI and machine learning strikes at the heart of the future of digital safety, digital security, and the ability to have trust and confidence as well as ethics in terms of what we're doing as operations and as business operations. So we're going to try to have a business relevant conversation on cybersecurity here today. Towards the end, as we get to the end of the hour, we may even pursue some very provocative conversations that may stimulate some questions from the audience. And so we hope you stick around to the end, where we may rip the Band-Aid off and ask some really hard questions. So to start, and to get the panel engaged, supply chain security. I think everyone's familiar with physical supply chain security. If everyone knows the ominous days of 9/11, we know that pre-9/11 there were physical supply chain security standards on the US side called CTPAT and on the Canadian side called FAST. And those two standards and certifications hold true today. But the level of voluntary organizations who voluntarily became compliant pre-9/11 was very low. And so the level of onboarding of these levels of certification were near zero. And then when 9/11 happened, the borders shut. Unless you had CTPAT or FAST certification, you couldn't cross borders. Now all of a sudden, the just-in-time business models impacted organizations. They had massive losses. And so surprisingly, everyone became a rush to certification. And the level of voluntary certification went through the roof. Well, we face the same issues now in the digital world. We face issues of, are there the right certifications and standards available to organizations? Are they voluntary? Are they going to become mandatory? So where do we stand in supply chain safety and security in a digital world? And so to throw that out, is it the lack of standards and the adoption of standards that are the issues? And are we reducing the diversity in supply chain by not driving compliance forward? Who wants to take that one on?
Yeah, so
No, please go right ahead.
No, supply chain is obviously a hot topic for a lot of organizations. It is for our customers. It is for us from being a cybersecurity firm. When you look at a lot of the data breaches and the challenges that have occurred through third-party providers, it's been pretty significant, some of the risks that it introduces into environments. So organizations have to, NIST has some great guidelines that we leverage in the US to help with, coming up with what the compliance regime looks like. But there's some, more on the operational side. How do you know, after you do that 1 point check in time, that vendor is going to continue to have good security practices? So there's other vendors out there that have tools called Security Scorecard or BitSight or what have you. And these companies actually will monitor the security profile of whatever your vendors are. So if you have, say, your top 10 or top 20 security vendors, you could plug those folks in there, and they'll actually monitor anything that's internet-facing or security practices that they might be aware of and actually assign a score of, A, B, C, or D. Some might use a stoplight chart, red, yellow, or green. And it allows you to determine, all right, they might have a high score when you sign that vendor on to provide services to you. If it drops off, it allows you to monitor it in a more continuous fashion versus kind of that compliance, once a year, annual cycle, or whatever it may be. But I think, technology is moving so fast. There's a lot of great frameworks to deal with the risk. But, to make it practical and to make it more impactful, it's got to be a continuous program.
I just wanted to simplify the conversation as well by, giving you the magic keys to how cybersecurity works and why it is we worry about the supply chain. So, as a practitioner, and I've been a practitioner most of my career, you learn that in order to manage security, you have to manage the process of managing risk. And the way that process works is you think to yourself, okay, I have this business process, this thing I worry about, and within the context of the process and the technologies that enable that process, are there threats? Those are the bad guys or even the good guys that can get inside my environment and somehow exploit a vulnerability. That could be an exposure in somebody's knowledge, which leads them to double click on something, and everybody double clicks. It could be a lack of a patch, it could be a configuration issue, and then create an impact. That could be an outage, it could be stealing data, it could be something else. And so as a practitioner, I can't secure everything, so I have to pick what I want to secure. And the way I do that is I use this risk formula. Risk equals threat times vulnerability times impact. And if the numbers come up high enough, that's where I'm going to focus. Now, the issue on supply chain today is that historically, we've always thought of our supply chain partners as trusted partners. We don't see them as potential threats. And the problem is that the bad guys, they know to go after the supply chain. So if you look back in history at some of the biggest breaches, so for instance, the Target breach, they targeted a supply chain partner. In that case, it was an HVAC provider to get into the infrastructure. So we always have to keep in mind today that those trusted individuals with whom we have a trusted relationship and for whom we give that trusted access, they could be introducing challenges deliberately or not deliberately into our environment. And so supply chain is a big issue. One caution though, there is no such thing as a compliance-driven security program that works. Compliance is good, it's the standards we follow, but you have to think about this within a risk context, and I'm sure we'll talk about more of that. But it isn't just about compliance, it's about the business process, it's about what you're trying to protect, and then the who you're giving access to and thinking about them and what you want to do with them.
So from a supply chain point of view, our view is that in general, the hardware providers, hardware devices, have pretty good track records in the area of supply chain integrity. Certainly better so than in the software area. One of the things that we've all seen, is the use of more and more open source software, using and combining different modules of software to build larger programs. And in many cases, it really does get quite hard to verify the supply chain integrity of those final builds. We've advocated the use of meticulous focus in on a bill of materials, truly thinking as much as possible about where you're getting your components. We're users of SWID marking technology to validate each piece of the supply chain and then be able to validate where they've come from and then what the end product looks like. I think this really does come down to the question of increased accountability from organizations. And it is also worth noting policymakers around the globe in the US and other geos are putting an extra focus on supply chain security and integrity today, which I think is putting more rightful pressure into the system to hold organizations accountable to review their supply chains, mark their technologies, document where they come from so that trust can be better enhanced.
If I can, I'd like to share a story time. I think in the field of supply chain attacks, trust is very important. I'll tell you a story that we encountered a couple of years ago when we were researching a threat group known as Wild Neutron, also known as Morpho, Butterfly. I think the US intelligence community calls them Pumpkin. And this was one of the, let's say, really sophisticated threat groups which succeeded in hacking Facebook, Apple, Microsoft, and Twitter. So to be honest, there are not many threat actors out there which can, brag about being able to hack these 4 companies at the same time. So as we were looking into Wild Neutron, we observed they were targeting one of our customers. And what was interesting about this customer is they installed 2 different security solutions, which is actually quite popular nowadays. You don't put all your eggs into just one basket, you install 2 different security solutions. And let's say if one solution misses one thing, the other one will catch it. So what was interesting here is that this attack went right through the, let's say, first solution they installed. It was stopped by our solution, but let's say badly stopped. And the reason was that the attack was digitally signed with a certificate which belonged to, let's say, a very popular hardware vendor. And we have this trust, let's say, schemas in which if files are signed by famous popular hardware vendors, they'll just go through all your security solutions because those are trusted vendors. Our solution stopped it. The reason was that let's say we were hunting specifically for that threat group and we recognized the attack. So we contacted the company in question, a company based in APAC region. I'm not going to name them. And it was very difficult to find a security person in that company. But eventually, you know, we went through PR with sales and administrative, and eventually we found a security person and said, you know what, we think that you got hacked and your, you know, digital keys, basically the keys to your kingdom, were stolen. And he said, yeah, we know. It's fine, don't worry. And we said, no, it's not fine. So yeah, when it comes to supply chain attacks, I think it breaks down to the fact that there's a lot of things happening and it's not fine. And it's only now that we hear about all these stories, and it's important to pay attention to such things.
And I think there's, in the infancy of what's becoming a supply chain compliance and standards environment, I know in Canada there was adoption of the UK standard, and then the Canadian government has now adopted kind of their own standard, the Cybersecure Canada initiative with 13 controls, between 10 and 13 controls. It's difficult enough, I think, to get companies to do 5 controls in the small and mid-sized level, but we're going to try for 10. I guess, what are your thoughts on, you know, demanding compliance? And so, obviously, that company that you mentioned didn't have those 5 controls in place, or any controls in place. In the physical world, you can do a lookup real quick to determine whether a company is a risk or not a risk on things like the different types of databases that are out there. There's no such thing, I don't think, in the cyber world. How do we get to a level of maturity? And what does that take from the business leader's perspective to drive to that level of maturity?
The question to me? I mean, typically speaking, what I'm beginning to see is more of a sort of an automated onboarding of any, if we're talking about technology components, there's the automated onboarding of that technology. So it will undergo some testing, either by a third party or by that organization, before it's integrated within the ecosystem. You know, one thing, just for those of you who are using or beginning to use IoT devices, what is important to recognize, you know, going back to the, yes, hardware generally speaking is sort of better from a security perspective. But keep in mind, an IoT device, let's say a Nest device or a smart meter or an insulin pump, these are, think about them as a 3-layer cake. So the first layer of the cake is a chip, and that's like a mini engine, and it makes that thing perform. It just gives it juice. And it is built by a manufacturer someplace overseas that wants one thing: performance at the lowest possible cost so they can keep their margin. No security inside. Then the second layer is the manufacturer who creates the function. That's like the insulin pump function. And what they do is they build the most performant device at the lowest possible cost. Then you've got the person who's going to, or the organization that's going to sell that device. They slap an application, they slap the brand around it, and they throw it into market with an application that's picking up the data. And they're thinking about security, but what about the other 2 layers? So one of the things that we're seeing, and the organizations that are doing this onboarding, this testing of these devices before they're putting them into the market, is they're finding that there are flaws in that code in the underlying layer. And sometimes they're finding logic bombs or other things that can be used to disrupt those devices. So that's why it's so important to not necessarily rely on any given, control standard, because it might not be looking at necessarily that right layer.
So, did you want to speak on it? Or? No.
Oh, you raised an absolutely essential point, and I think the whole concept of security by design being baked into each piece of the build is absolutely essential.
Yep.
So that's actually the segue to that question. So safety by design, security by design. Traditionally, companies that made products make the product, and then after they make the product, they ask security to figure out how to secure it. And so quite often it's build fast and fix often. In the case of companies like Medtronics, who had to do a recall on installed pacemakers, that was highly inconvenient to their customers. So in the OT space, safety by design, security by design, IoT space, I mean, what do the business leaders in the room need to understand about product development, product design? Where does security or digital risk management need to sit in that particular product development chain?
From a lot of companies are doing what's called DevOps, and basically it's an accelerated development process. When we talk about doing secure development, doing secure testing of the code, you also got to have a verification phase, but basically you're embedding security architects, security engineers right with the software development teams at the time that the product and the solutions are being built. So it's happening, kind of the security built in up front. The verification piece, like in my organization, we have what's called a red team. The red team actually acts as an adversary or an attacker. They'll either try to reverse engineer the software, they'll attack the software. If they find any issues, then it gets put back to the development team, which again has the embedded security folks, security engineers in that team, and they can turn around and reiterate and fix it before it goes into production. So, it's a couple things. And then when you talk about supply chain security, from a vendor perspective, when we have customers, signing on or leveraging our products, we actually have independent firms come in and attest to our security practices, to our security maturity models. And they take a look at it. They also come in and actually will do penetration tests or attempt to try to break into our environment. We call them compromise assessments. And so we also provide that information to our customers. I also, like to have that as well when I think about protecting CrowdStrike, because that's part of my organization's goal, is to keep the company safe, protect our customers, and what have you. I think the challenge with a lot of risk management regimes is that they, again, just like compliance, they don't iterate fast enough. The threats are changing. We see over 300 billion security events every single day as a company, based on our view of what we have across the globe. And so companies, if you're being targeted by a sophisticated adversary, that might change your threat model. One day you might not be getting targeted, the next day they might be, and sometimes that happens in hours. So a lot of these things that we put to paper, creates challenges in trying to keep up with an operational tempo. I remember going back just 15, 20 years ago, there used to be 5 countries that were really that were nation-state adversaries in the cyberspace that were engaging in information operations. Now, in today's world, just about every country is in that game. And it really is a target-rich environment. Your data's at risk. As we heard earlier, your vendors are at risk because sometimes they'll come in through the side door versus attacking you direct on. And then we also have the issues when we think about software development, the intentional insider threat, and then we have what's called unintentional insider threat. So an unintentional insider threat might be somebody that misconfigures or just might have bad coding practices. Hopefully your gates and things will catch those things, but the intentional insider is somebody that is going to cause harm to your environment and might put your company at risk. And that person can reside within your own corporation. It could be a part of your contract team. It could be an outside business partner that you might have. So, when you think about risk, there's a lot of them, and so you got to be dynamic and really kind of take an operational approach where we all have to do the contracts, we all have to build in the provisions and the compliance checks and make sure that we're following standards and communicating that to folks. That certainly plays a role and raises the bar across all your development teams, but you also have to have that operational component.
I'd be curious how many business leaders in the room have their cybersecurity or their security engineers embedded into their operations groups. I would bet it's not a whole lot, and so I think that's an area of maturity that we need to take a look at. next question that kind of morphs is the need for collaboration. There's collaboration internally within organizations we just talked about for properly designing and creating new products and services. What about data sharing between government and industry? What about even within industry? So again, if you harken back to the days of 9/11, the 9/11 Commission report identified colossal intelligence failures and the inability to share data across organizations, even within the same organization. And I think it's more important than ever to see strong collaboration and data sharing and threat intelligence sharing between industry sectors, organizations, et cetera. So someone want to elaborate on kind of what we're seeing in the data sharing world and where do we need to get to? What should we be aspiring to achieve?
I'm going to start from a little bit of a different angle, which is there is a big push today for boards of directors to take more oversight responsibility over cybersecurity, and the C-suites are also becoming more involved and engaged. And that is, I think, a positive move because it is leading to more of the implementation and instantiation of the secure by design principles that we were just describing. And keep in mind today, new business initiatives, if I'm going to do an ERP upgrade or transform HR, transform my customer experience, only 15% of those projects today have security inside. So think about that as you're buying a car and there's no seatbelt. You're trying to put the seatbelt in afterwards. Now, why I'm bringing this up is because I think that the information sharing that we're talking about here, and I do want to sort of continue to touch on this, is very technical amongst security professionals. I think one of the challenges we have as security professionals is convincing the boards of directors and the C-suite about the importance of cybersecurity and sort of the principles that need to be involved, because it's not a technology problem, it's a business risk problem. And so I think that from a collaboration perspective and an information sharing perspective, I'd like to see organizations like the NACD and the other organizations that are facilitating board and C-level communication get more engaged in enabling the sharing of that information, because at the end of the day, we from our seats aren't going to fix this problem. This has to be driven tops down, and so that's another area that I think is worthy of some exploration.
Yeah, and I would agree with Kris, but I don't think you have to go much past the organization today to see that sometimes the information or lack of information sharing creates white space and particular attack vectors. And the chief security officer, which is often the physical security guy who has responsibility often for insider threat or managing what's going on in the dark web or social media, too often are orphaned from the CISO and his effort or her effort solely on cyber. And so today we see more and more fusion centers coming together where a CSO and a CISO are combining to look at all threats and look at the remediation and the action plans to put in place to remove the white spaces and make sure there isn't that opportunity for either an insider or something outside externally affecting you, as well as the cyber. And in fact, the combination of those two groups often leads to huge cost savings because it doesn't have to be two 24/7, 365 teams of people watching monitors. They can be lower level people that basically elevate the threat to either a cyber or a physical person. Couple of financial institutions I can think of saved last year well over $10 million a year just by combining those into what are currently being called fusion centers. So that sharing of data both internally as well as externally is important and a huge source of reducing the white space for cyber attack or others, inside threat caused or external advocates, as well as cost reduction.
So from an information sharing point of view, there's a good news and bad news story here. The good news is some real effective things are actually happening today that have raised the bar. An example of that is the Cyber Threat Alliance, the CTA. CEOs from leading cybersecurity companies, whether McAfee, Palo Alto Networks, Symantec, Cisco, Fortinet, and others, I think we're up to 10 organizations. We've all come together over the last 2 years with our CEOs, our CISOs, and we're actively sharing threat indicators between and amongst ourselves, also with DHS and other governmental departments. This has proven to be very successful. It needs to grow. We need to bring it more global. And the objective that we're working on is to make this information sharing as real time as possible, as bidirectional as possible, and then with governments that are interested in the same objectives, getting their secret sauce data into those data sets so we can really drive change. The other big point that I would add is it needs to go far beyond simple indicators of compromise. We need to get more fidelity on information so that we can not just say, hey, there's a red car or a blue car driving around the hotel and they're of a concern, but that we can use the behavior of specific vehicles, IDing the methods and tactics they've deployed in the past so that we can get to them sooner, faster, and shut down a threat before it even happens.
I think there's some good models that have worked too. There's what's called the National Cyber Forensic Training Alliance. And basically it's ran by the US FBI. Basically a couple of times a year they bring in federal law enforcement or the Ministry of Interior, depending on the country, from all around the globe. And so we have what's called mutual legal assistance treaties that often get leveraged, but the problem is that cyber attacks happen so quickly. If you're going down the MLAT process, it's a very bureaucratic process. It takes sometimes 6 months to a year. And so by bringing in federal law enforcement from Ukraine and other countries and partners, along with the security researchers in the room, it's kind of almost like a fusion center, but a couple of times a year. And everybody kind of talks about what are your top 3 or 4 threat actors that you're worried about. And you have the law enforcement folks right there that are literally able to phone back home and make arrests or carry out actions without going through a long and lengthy process. And I think it's been a really good model. It's been an effective model, especially with some of the major botnet takedowns that they've led. But I think that's just one instance on the law enforcement side that has been really effective. Another model is, in our case, industry places a threat intelligence analyst that has access to all of our intelligence that we see. You know, I mentioned those 300 plus billion events, that the amount of data and visibility that we have. We have somebody actually sits in a U.S. government fusion center, and along with lots of other companies in the cybersecurity space have security researchers or threat intelligence analysts that sit in there. They also run national level exercises to actually think about what if scenarios that might affect. It could be one year the transportation sector, it could be the energy sector. And by having industry expertise blended in with government experts and leads, they're able to take rapid action. Law enforcement, the intelligence community, all those folks are represented. And so, I think it's a great example. I like to see it, continue to expand. I know going back to the early days of when we were building DHS, you could get in a room, you'd have FBI, Secret Service, us, and a couple other agencies, and somebody would almost always say, who should I report an incident to? And everybody raises their hand on the government side, right? So, it's still a challenge for a lot of organizations. I think it's gotten better, but I think the Fusion Center concept is absolutely crucial, and it needs to be a partnership between governments and industry, and then countries, at the country level as well.
I like to talk about this maybe from 2 specific points of view. I won't talk about sharing information between companies, which is something it has been going on for many, many years. As you said, CTA, there's other organizations as well, like CARO, Mute Group. I guess 2, let's say, very sensitive points here would be the sharing of information from the government to the private sector and sharing from the private sector towards the government. When it comes, let's say, from sharing from the private sector to the government, from at least what I hear is that a lot of people complain about the black hole. So they share information with the government and it goes into a black hole. And nobody knows what happens with the information. Is it actually used for anything? There's no feedback. So if there's any government folks in the audience here, can you raise your hands? You know what to do. Don't be a black hole with the information. From the other point of view of sharing information from the government towards the private sector, historically there's been a distrust towards, let's say, the intelligence agencies, because the reality is that intelligence agencies usually have the best visibility when it comes to attacks. We see something, CrowdStrike sees something, McAfee sees something. Nobody has like a full picture of everything that is happening. However, intelligence agencies sometimes they see more than all of us combined. And sharing of information from that side to the private sector is important. Historically, there's been a distrust, like if you, let's say, cooperate with these agencies, automatically there's suspicions about your company, right? So from this point of view, I think that what happened in the UK with the creation of the National Cybersecurity Center model, they took it out of the GCHQ, they took the defensive part and put in a separate organization, removing the trust issue. So that makes it a lot easier to share information with the private sector. And the same happening here in Canada, which I think is a really great thing. So this model needs to be replicated. We need it to happen in more and more countries around the world for this sharing of information and cooperation to, let's say, grow and get better.
I just want to tag on to that with one practical story. So I'm working with a dairy farm, one of the biggest milk producers, and they also have kind of cornered the market on infant formula. And they have a good relationship with the Intel community in their country. And it was through that relationship that they learned that they were being targeted by a terrorist cell who was hoping to interrupt the manufacturer of the infant formula because it would impact so many infants in this particular region. So I think that recognizing today, we've been talking a lot about over this past couple days, income inequity. We've been talking about some of these social problems. We also have to recognize that in today's world, cyber attackers aren't just after the money. Sometimes they want to make a point. There is some other motivation for their act. And that is particularly helpful when talking to the intel agencies to recognize from a brand reputation perspective who out there may not like me and begin to build that into your threat modeling process.
Well, that's, what you bring up is a fascinating point. There's always been this, and I came out of the intelligence world years ago, there's always been this I don't know if it's naivete or this hope that if I'm operating within a country and there's information that can help me protect my corporate operations, that I'll get the heads up. And I don't think we're there yet, but wouldn't that be great? Because ultimately the cyber threat issues impact the economic operations of every nation. And from a critical infrastructure protection perspective, it behooves the government to ensure that the operators and the groups that are participating in critical infrastructure, whether it's food or it's financial services or it's power and energy and utilities, help them continue to keep the lights on to keep things moving forward. Next area I want to dissect just real quickly for the business leaders in the room is I think we're still in I'll call it the fog, but this issue around public cloud, private cloud, on-prem, one's more safe than the other. Is that a misnomer? What do leaders here need to know about going to the cloud?
Yeah, I think it's going to be just like our conversation around third-party providers, right, and doing our due diligence around risk management. I mean, you can badly configure a cloud just as systems in the cloud as well as in a data center. So, some of the risks are still there. I think the big benefit of migration to cloud-based services is, in some instances, it's a force multiplier. You're augmenting your security team with their security team. If you structure the relationship, appropriately, it'll help keep additional eyes and monitoring in place. There's a lot of great tools, but I think the biggest advantage is you're not bringing along a lot of that security or technical debt. So, every organization I've ever dealt with, every investigation I've been involved with, every organization has a certain amount of dirty laundry or issues within their environment. Migrating to a cloud environment is an opportunity to kind of clean that up. The other big issue that a lot of companies have, especially when it comes to risk management, is knowing where are my assets, where is my data, what are those things that are critical to delivering products and services. Well, when you move into a cloud type environment, you're getting a monthly bill on that, and it's itemized. So you're going to know those assets. That's another big benefit where in a data center, over decades of technical and security debt, and especially not being able to know where that server is hidden in a closet somewhere within a corporation that might be key to the business, those challenges exist, and those migrations and modernization efforts help ferret some of those things out. But I do think that the security tools in a lot of these environments give the security team a greater level of visibility of what your IT organization is doing, as well as your development teams, just based on the types of logs and things like that it provides for you.
So the move to the cloud overall is a very good thing, and in general it will deliver higher levels of security than on-prem environments.
Particularly if you're a mid-sized organization or a smaller organization, you don't have the people, the processes, the technology budgets to really secure the work that you do. You're really far better off contracting out to a Google or an Amazon. It is interesting, though, what we have seen is that as more organizations drive to the cloud, the same sorts of technology hairballs that you saw in the on-prem world are starting to emerge in the cloud world. So if you're a large multinational, you might be contracting out with 2 or 3 large cloud providers. You might be running hundreds or thousands of cloud service applications. And the attackers are smart. They're going after the unprotected seams between and among cloud environments. In fact, we put a big bet on the table when we purchased SkyHigh, the leading CASB security company out there, to really address this device-to-cloud security challenge. We think good progress is being made, and we're very focused on it. But I would just say, in short, it's a good trend, but we need to be vigilant of the new security risks that emerge in the cloud environment also.
So we've mentioned things like board of directors, the C-suite, the CISOs. What does leadership look like in an organization, in a mature organization, in going forward, like everyone here starting tomorrow? Where should these people report to in an organization? What does an organization structure look like that's mature and that is figured out that this is relevant and woven into the fabric of their whole organizational risk management initiative? What does that look like? Kris, do you want to start?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. I do this a lot. Nobody's got to figure it out. So I think that's the reality is that it's a process. We're working toward it. I think historically security has been a very command and control kind of environment. I'd like to build it and then keep it and maintain it, and that's just not working. So what we're beginning to see is a more, and I'll put it in quotes, agile environments being driven. So the concept is, I want security not to be a negative factor, keep the business behind, and I recognize the importance of security, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to create almost like a committee. And each of the business lines is going to have a business security officer. And that business security officer is going to be responsible for doing what I've been indicating, which is understanding the risk to the business line, understanding the underlying technology assets, understanding the compliance requirements, understanding where the data is, and then enabling the compliance with policies, processes, and risk management requirements that have been established by the chair of the committee, which is the CISO. Now, the CISO has really is 3 functions. One is acting as the chair, communicating with these individuals, as well as managing the policies and the processes, so establishing kind of the baseline requirements, managing the service catalog of capabilities that all of the business units are going to digest, and then maintaining the SOC, having visibility over what's going wrong. So that becomes sort of the organizational construct. It's very distributed. It could be hard line or dotted line into the security officer. The big question becomes now, who gets the security officer? Is that the chief risk officer? Is it the CIO, which is less customary nowadays? Chief legal officer, chief data officer. You see it everywhere. I mean, my general answer to this question of where should the CISO report is, where is it a good cultural fit? And the CISO has to have access to all of the business unit owners, as well as to the C-suite to be successful, because again, this is a tops down. And so a lot of the work today is really, it's not just on implementation of these more agile models, but it's also in the plumbing of the communication between the board, the C-suite, and the CISOs themselves, and enabling that effective communication so that the risk process can be executed and appropriate measures be implemented and the reactions be smooth and effective.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's based on organizational culture, right? But I think, like in our current model, we feed into the chief operating officer, and it's viewed from a business impact perspective. And we talked about the blending of physical security and cybersecurity. When you think about business impact, the COO needs to know, how many employees are affected. Was it because of a physical issue? In the past, we've had to deal with, not here, but other places, whether it was an anthrax attack type issue in a mail sorting facility to a malware outbreak at a data center. The chief operating officer or the lead for that organization wants to know, when are we going to be able to get the resumed services? When are we going to be able to take care of the employees? What's the status? It lets them know what is the real business impact in real time. And so I think, again, totally dependent on the organizational culture, but I think the model of having the physical and cyber feeding directly into the CIO has been, I've seen it work and experienced it myself at a couple of organizations, has been really effective. It's usually, the CIO is also up here because the CISO often is evaluating the security practices and, kind of doing that audit function of, across, do they have good change management practices? Are they meeting the standards for the, hardening, those types of things and protecting the systems accordingly? It really is down to size of the organization. You mentioned the chief risk officer, they have a role to play. They actually will sometimes, have that second layer of oversight of the security organization. Is the security organization doing all the things that they should be doing? I've got the benefit of where I currently sit. Our board of directors takes an active role in wanting to know our security practices. What are we prepared for what's our crisis management plan? What do we have in place to deal with a number of contingencies that could affect our ability to deliver those products or services? They ask a lot of tough questions, and of course we have to provide that feedback, but we also get independently assessed, and that gets provided back to the audit committee of the board as well. So I think there's a lot of great models out there. It just depends on the organization.
Yeah, I would concur with both those comments that we've already mentioned 4 different C-level officers reporting up into a CEO ultimately. A slightly different view, given I'm on 2 public boards, and as Jerry just said, and Kris did to some extent, these issues are taken seriously by the board, but they're also very expensive. And so if you're at the top of that food chain, you're concerned with the proliferation and the cost and how do you manage it. And so that's where I come back to, there has to be some sort of structure that leads to not duplication in every single department and every single unit, because that's a kind of responsive structure instead of one that collaborates, reduces the white space and the risk for the company, and ultimately costs less money to defend and stay an operating entity when attacked or on the occurrence of an attack on a regular basis. So I think more and more CEOs are looking at our COs and saying, how do I integrate these functions under someone? And it could be any of the 4 we talked about: CRO, CSO, CISO, CIO, or a COO. But it does have to be something that's focused on with some integration, because without that, it just gets very, very expensive. So it's an excellent point, this challenge of duplicative resources. We also see the challenge of duplicative resources in the area of cybersecurity solutions. A lot of organizations will deploy solutions from 20, 30 different vendors, and that complexity indeed produces its own set of risks, and the attackers are really going after the seams between and among those systems. We've put a lot of innovative work in the area of an open source, open architecture technology that's designed to exchange information between and among vendors so that we can solidify defenses and reduce redundancy. And then the big thing is giving CEOs and senior leadership one pane of glass to evaluate their security environment in real time. Those kinds of investments will help reduce that kind of duplication, which can also occur in the technology space.
And wanted to pick up on the leadership piece. So complex, trying to figure out where the right people sit in the organization and how they have the right oversight and the ability to impact operations. Let's talk about business continuity. You mentioned it briefly. I think every company here, every organization has been through the tabletop tests, the business continuity management plans. I think now with the digital threats that are out there, I don't know how many companies here are giving enough time and attention to the extended issues that could impact operations. And I'm wondering, thoughts here on the panel of what are best practices for, is it tabletop, is it actually using a kinetic cyber lab, using some of your IT capabilities in your OT labs to run hard tests, business continuity tests, and truly explain to your board and your C-suite how many days you can be down based on the types of threats that you're facing?
Yeah, I'm actually seeing quite a bit of this. It's actually the resilience functions. It depends on if you're financial services. You think of resilience a little bit differently, but the backup sort of, and the recovery function and the cybersecurity function are getting much closer. So going back to sort of, this all ties together. So the boards are getting more involved, and the boards are saying, I don't understand what you're spending money on. Help me understand the value of my investments. And so organizations are implementing more of this risk orientation. Well, how do you do that? Well, the best place to do that is the business impact analysis, which is the thing that drives your sort of resilience tests. So what's happening is organizations now are saying, okay, as part of the business impact analysis, so every year we go through this process of picking out what's important. So what they're doing is they're saying, okay, these are my tier one processes, business processes and applications. What are the threats to these applications? Oh, gee, wait a minute, this is cybersecurity. So they're running those tests within the context of these initiatives. So I think that's all very healthy and important, and exactly to your point, these things are coming together.
Yeah, I think it's a terribly important topic because we've talked about the defense spectrum here today, but the fact is, if you're a major corporation, even a mid-sized corporation, it's not a matter of if, it's only a matter of when you're going to be penetrated. And, so much of the effort goes into defense, but if you can't restore operations and communicate with people to ensure the business is running, it's costing millions, if not billions of dollars. A great example of storytelling is Michael Leighton at Sony. They were hacked in an infamous attack by a foreign actor, and they were down so long that he went on CNBC and said, we were down to rummaging through the basement for paper check printers because we couldn't print checks for employees to pay them, and we were trying to find old BlackBerry phones that were still secure to communicate with. And so the idea that those systems, business continuity, risk analysis, business operation plans, are all in the same system that is then compromised, leaves you with no capabilities and an ability to have a redundant path at a minimum communications. We happen to be the provider, Sony, and he nicely on CNBC said, well, thank God we had an Everbridge in place because the majority of employees we could communicate securely to during the entire process to keep the business running. But without that and without access to the business plans, how do you recover? So one of the things people have to think about, especially if they're running a business, is, okay, I have to put up a very strong defense, and the lion's share of the dollars are going to go there, but if you don't have some sort of incident management or out-of-band communication capability, you're not going to be able to recover once it does occur.
I know a good example from my past. We had a scenario that we ran through with our leadership team, and this is where it crosses over from IT to HR to operations to general management, et cetera. And so we realized that for every day that we were down, it would be 3 days to recover, to which the GM said, well, then let's let go of all of our contract staff, because who needs them? I'm not paying for them. To which HR said, it takes me 3 weeks to find 400 people and train them. To which he said, okay, we'll keep paying them. So it's a phenomenal exercise to help test the stress of your organization and how you're actually going to make a decision on a really bad day. The future, where are we going here? We're continuing to digitize, we're continuing to connect more devices to digital twin a lot of our OT operating systems. The number of IoT, OT, and IT connections are increasing, not decreasing. Our level of access to new data sets are increasing, not decreasing. Our customers are demanding ongoing 24/7 real-time operations that never stop. Where are we going? What do the next 5 years look like from a business risk management perspective? Where should the focus be in these organizations?
I think a big challenge, we talked about cloud services, and when different business units can go sign up for cloud services, the IT organization can go obviously sign up and set up enterprise agreements, but you get into what's called data sprawl, And so one of the things, cloud services are great, and like I said, it can be a force multiplier, but at the same time, you've got to have a good handle on where is your data going, where is it residing, and I think that's going to continue to take off. IT services are pretty much a commodity. You can go out and find whether it's customer relationship management tools in the cloud to, communication tools, things like Slack, those types of things. So when you think about this data sprawl problem, a lot of the vendors now offer what's called bring your own key. And what that means is I can now encrypt the data and only your company has access to that data. So even if there is a particular issue, even if you do have some data sprawl, you want to make sure you're tracking that down. We talked about cloud access security brokers. That gives you some visibility to kind of find some of those shadow IT type applications that might exist out there. But really get your arms around where that data is sitting, making sure it's protected at risk, minimize the insider threats at your third-party vendors, as well as internally. But I think we're just going to continue to see that rapid adoption of a lot of these tools that makes business move a lot faster.
Another area of success has been the NIST cybersecurity framework, developed a few years ago with NIST and the private sector working collaboratively. It's really developed broad-based adoption in the U.S. of a risk-based model, and I think it's done a lot of good. We've seen similar kinds of risk-based, standards-based frameworks being adopted in other countries. The UK, Japan has a version. That's a good, macro trend line to get a diversity of organizations that maybe don't think about security in the first instance. It's maybe not in their DNA, progressively moving up the maturity model of security.
And just on NIST, raise your hands, everyone know what the NIST framework is, or NIST in general? You're going to want to look into this. NIST has supplanted ISO as the #1 by far framework model that organizations are following for risk management, both in their operations, but also in things like skills gap, workforce. You're going to want to know this. This is going to be big. The other thing is that it's actually to become, on the path towards NIST versus ISO. And I'm not picking on ISO here, but incredibly cost adverse ISO standards versus where the NIST framework's going. The other thing I would caution is I would think that everyone in here would want to standardize pan countries on one standard. So NIST should be the framework that's looked at. And I say this because we know of other countries who are starting to think about, scratch their heads and think, should I create my own? Don't create your own. Work with something that's invested in, works, and can be a standard across supply chain.
So how many of you have a chief digital officer? No one has a chief digital officer? Chief transformation officer, somebody who's doing a digital transformation for the company? So what we're seeing a lot today is the move toward omnichannel marketing. So omnichannel marketing is this concept that when I talk to my consumers, I talk to my employees, I talk to whomever, I'm not just going to use one type of mechanism for communication. It might be my consumers, for instance, or if I'm in a bank, they're going to be, Skyping me on using chat or something on their phone in their mobile application because there's a problem with their account or there's a problem with processing a check, and then they're going to be on their laptop at the same time, and maybe because there's a hold, they're on their phone and they're calling at the same time. So they're trying to connect to you in lots of different ways using different technology forms. And that is driving a need to change the way in which we authenticate people to these various sites. And that's actually having a downstream impact on cybersecurity. It's the way we look at the human being and how that human being interacts with technology, and making sure that we have visibility across all of the different ways in which they're connecting to us, as well as, just from an underlying visibility perspective, what they could possibly do bad within that context. So that's driving a lot of cybersecurity behavior today, is that open banking scenarios, omnichannel marketing, et cetera. So most organizations are undergoing this, so I would assume that we're going to see a lot of focus in that area. The supply chain, again, people are recognizing security needs to be built inside. So more testing before things are being rolled out, at least that's my hope. But I also think that on the sort of the negative side in the industry, I do think that there's going to be a bit of a pullback in buying of tools. I think that, by virtue of the board, the C-suite, getting a little bit tired of all the investments they've made and not being able to understand what the value is, I think there's a cleanup happening. It's consolidate. It's stop with the duplication. I don't have one of these things, I have 12 of these things. And that complexity is creating risk. So I do think just not only from a cost control perspective, from a complexity equals risk perspective, we're going to begin to see that consolidation of controls within an organization, and a control is the thing that you use to manage the risk.
Yeah, and I just a very quick comment, but couldn't agree more. And the fact that the cost is being driven up astronomically, it almost makes it, if you're in an operating role, you're forced to look at how do I consolidate these groups? How do I get to a single pane of glass? How do I look at my physical and security and supply chain and inside and external and brand effects all in the same area and use the same resources and then separate them for the remediation or the defense, but not duplicate that, because that's gotten to be very, very expensive for large organizations in the billions of dollars. And it does feel like that's starting to come together, and people are going to start to put their foot down and say we have to spend, but it has to be more thoughtful, and we don't need to do it 4 times to equate to the same value.
Getting back to your initial question was like where the future kind of goes and what we are looking for. There's one thing which we see, that is that the more data you have, obviously the harder and harder it is to secure it, and computing power and data becomes cheaper every day, Moore's law and all that. And the truth is that you don't really need more data. I'll give you an example. I remember my first computer had a 40 megabytes hard drive. Nowadays I have storage at home, in my home, 40 terabytes. And I was perfectly content with 40 megabytes. I didn't need more. And nowadays, those 40 terabytes, you can find things to fill 40 terabytes for sure. And the reality is that all these things become cheaper and cheaper. People will find more things they can collect and store in there. Depending on your type of business, you will store more information, more, receipts, telemetry, whatever kind of data. So the more data you have, it will become harder and harder to secure it. And you can't stop that, it's unstoppable. This is one of the things which, the reality is that you'll have to spend more money to secure more data, which is coming, it's inevitable. The other thing is that we have kind of, let's say, 2 poles here. We have on one hand, monocultures. So let's say in your organization you have only Apple computers, just one example. You'll say, we'll only use software from Apple, we'll only use hardware from Apple and nothing else. The other side, let's say you have a diversity culture, let's say use all kind of devices from all vendors. You'll use Windows machines, Linux, firewalls from all vendors. And I can't say that one model is better than the other. They both have advantages and disadvantages. So for instance, there's, let's say, a vulnerability in a specific brand of a router. If you have 10 kinds of different routers, only that specific brand will be affected. The other ones will still stand, right? On the other hand, when you have, let's say, only one type of hardware or software in the organization, the chance for that one to be targeted can be smaller. But the moment that gets targeted, everything falls apart. So I think in the end it all comes to balance, how to balance all these different things, and balance spending, balance the amount of data you have to secure, the amount of energy and time and resources you put into all this huge ecosystem, and still you have to assume that one day you will get breached. Be it ransomware, be it a targeted attack, be it a combination of a targeted attack and ransomware. So you'll have to pay for that in a way or another. The only thing that we see is that in general, companies pay more attention to security after they get breached for the first time. So that is the sad truth.
So we're heading towards the end of the hour here, so I'm going to throw something provocative out that we can either answer or not answer and walk away from, and hopefully engage the audience here. And for those who want to stick to ask questions after the question's asked, let's do that. Let's have the conversation. I know we're heading into dinner. So we've talked about supply chain. We've talked about, is it better to diversify or to stick to one platform? In France, they, on the critical infrastructure protection side, they have gone out and the government has identified all critical infrastructure protection targets. So what do they need to secure for their country? They have also gone into the supply chain and stamped things as French tech. So they have sovereign technology that they can trust, and on a really, really bad day, that is what is in a supply chain. We're here in Canada, we don't have a whole lot of Canadian tech. We don't have a whole lot of sovereign tech. And so we're beholden to the decisions made on technology purchase and procurement. There are issues that we've all heard about and continue to be raised around, so us as business leaders, how do we figure out what technologies we can objectively trust going forward? What technologies might have a geopolitical spin that is stopping us from moving forward? Where's the source of validation and verification of what we can and can't use? And in the example of a Chinese company, there was a telco CEO in this country who came out and said, if this country decides that we can't use that technology, which is embedded in every single device, modem, tower in the country, who's paying for the rip and replace? And if we do that today and we use a different technology, when that one gets blacklisted, what do we do tomorrow? So I throw it to the panel and say, is there a need in the future for greater, we'll call it verification and a trusted source of, Swiss verification of supply chain so that business leaders can make procurement decisions with clarity?
I think, there's so many different ways to attack an organization. I mean, it's good to have a good housekeeping label or a certification on a particular platform. But the reality is, we talked about the adoption of cloud technologies. Most organizations, especially large organizations, you look at the financial sector, move into zero trust models. The perimeter of having everything within a single data center, all your routing infrastructure in a single location, now that's being diversified, it's being used through third parties. The zero trust model is based on where an employee might be connecting from, have they been authenticated. There's all these new capabilities to kind of deal with that kind of problem, because can you really trust your supply chain? Can you trust a particular product that has millions of lines of code? So you have to kind of move into the zero trust model. There's some great solutions and approaches to it. Google put out a paper called Beyond Corp that speaks to this in great detail, speaks to it in business terms, and there's also a technical paper. There's also a lot of vendors that can kind of support that. But the reality is, like in our organization, we're 68% remote workers. We don't all have folks going into a central office, so they're connecting from whether it's a home office, a hotel, an airplane, depending on the situation. And these technologies will automatically assess where they're connecting from and adjust what they might have access to. They might only get access to email, but maybe not the customer relationship management tool, because they don't want to have, create that exposure. So I think that's kind of where organizations are moving in that direction to kind of deal with that issue.
Yeah, I think the question of authenticity is a big question, but it's not just limited to technology. It's also people and the authenticity of data that we're using to feed our machine learning models. So I think this is a big question, but it's going to take another session to actually answer.
So with that, I want to thank the panel for their time today and everyone here in the audience. We will stick around. If you have questions you want to ask, please do approach. Otherwise, thank you all so much and enjoy dinner tonight.